Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's episode by episode review for Lost Season 1, Part 1. So this is a first in a series of videos where I plan to cover every episode of Lost. Now this series I've decided to do in batches of about 8 episodes or so. So for the first 3 seasons, which are longer, I will split them into 3 parts. For the last 3 seasons, which are shorter, I'll split them into 2 parts. So for this video, I will cover Season 1, episodes 1 through 8. So I've done reviews for each season of Lost already, but for those videos I more of covered the whole season in abstract terms as a whole, and I dealt mostly with how it pertains to the ending of the show. For this video I'm just going to delve deeper into each individual episode, and also I'm going to do it spoiler free. That is, it will be free of spoilers beyond these 8 episodes, as I want to encourage those who haven't seen the show to watch it along with me, or perhaps some just happen to be getting into the show. However, you should have seen up to episode 8, Confidence Man, before watching any part of this video, as it will feature spoilers for the first 8 episodes, but not beyond that. However, I will have a spoiler section at the end of the video for those who have seen the entire series of Lost, just so I can give my overall thoughts on how these episodes relate to the ending of the show or to the rest of the show, but I will give a proper spoiler warning before doing so. Now, when I first saw Lost all the way back in 2005, yes, not 2004 because New Zealand got it a bit late and I didn't watch it from the beginning, I was visiting some friends and playing some board games, and in the background they were watching Lost, the episode I now identify as episode 14 Special. And I wasn't paying full attention to it. I just noticed it had that guy in the wheelchair from Oz, the asshole Admiral guy from the Next Generation episode Pegasus, and Mary from Lord of the Rings. But that was enough to pique my interest, as that was a strange cast of characters. But I didn't think much of it until a couple months later, when a workmate was telling me how much he loved the show. So that gave me the motivation to start watching it. So I did. The first episode I watched all the way through was episode 20, Do No Harm. And if you know the episode, you know it's a bad place to start. It focused on the character of Jack Shephard and Boone, 2 characters I did not at all recognize from what little I saw of Special, so I was really lost. But I watched the rest of the season in order as it aired, and I was of course very lost, as it referenced heavily events from earlier episodes I hadn't seen. So after season 2 started airing, after I saw the first 6 episodes of season 2, I tried to go online and find earlier episodes of season 1 that I missed, but this was in This was in New Zealand in 2005, when finding TV shows online wasn't so easy, so I only managed to grab random episodes. I tried to watch them in order, but there were certain episodes missing, some of them quite vital, so there were still gaps in what I saw, and I was missing vital pieces of information in the overall story, as I didn't see episodes like All the Best Cowboys Have Daddy Issues, Homecoming, Numbers, and Deus Ex Machina. It wasn't until Christmas of 2005 where I got the complete Season 1 DVD collection of Lost for Christmas that I finally managed to watch all of Season 1 of Lost all the way through in order. And at this stage I had already seen most of the episodes already. So the reason why I mention this is because this shattered way I was introduced into the show did affect my viewing of Season 1, as most of the mysteries of the earlier episodes weren't as shocking to me because I was already aware of some of the follow-up to them, for some of them anyway. And I was already familiar with the characters when I watched the episodes in which they were introduced, so perhaps that reason I'm not as big on these first batch of episodes as many people are. However, I do think it's fitting that this video will cover up to episode 8, as although I have no concrete proof of this, I surmise that up to episode 8 the writers had no long-term plan for the show whatsoever, and it wasn't until episode 9 that they started coming up with some long-term plans. The writers have said before that when the show first started they weren't at all thinking of future seasons or future episodes, because they were thinking the show would probably get canceled anyway. And it wasn't until it hit as a success that they actually started plotting it out. And in my headcanon, I can see it starting to come together and foreshadow future events and set up ongoing storylines in episode 9 and beyond. So I do strongly believe that even though there are quotes of the writers insisting otherwise, that in these first 8 episodes they were very much just making it up as they go, and there was no forethought about where the story was going. At any rate, let's jump right into the episodes, starting with the pilot, Part 1. And yes, I will talk about the pilot in 2 parts. As to my recollection, this is how they aired it. But for episodes, double episodes, 2-parters that aired in one, I will talk about in one go. But anyway, the first thing I have to say about the pilot is I'm not as big on this episode as many people are. Most would consider it one of the best episodes of the entire show, and some would even put it in their top 10. I honestly always considered it one of the poorer episodes of the season, but again, this may have something to do with how I was introduced to the show, as for many, this was the first episode they saw, as it was intended to be, and it was the one that drew them in with the big spectacular crash scene. But for me, I was already familiar with the show's setup and characters when I first saw this episode, so I wasn't nearly as impressed by it. In fact, when I first watched the entire season in proper order, I wasn't that impressed with the show until episode 4, which is where I thought the show really improved upon itself. Also, as far as the crash scene goes, where Jack comes across the wreckage of the plane and the carnage of everyone there, I do admit that was a pretty intense, really well done scene, and I could see why a lot of people were so blown away by it. Particularly if you cast your minds back to 2004, where having such a grandiose and well-produced scene like this was unheard of on TV. Nowadays it's commonplace with big spectacles like Game of Thrones or some Netflix originals, but back then these kind of scenes that you only got in movies, not TV, so in that regard it was groundbreaking. In fact, for many years the Lost pilot remained the most expensive pilot ever made until some of those HBO and Netflix shows came out, whereas now it's not even in the top 10. But even when this episode first came out, I wasn't that into TV and was probably more of judging it by movie standards, which although I was impressed by this scene, I probably wasn't completely blown away by it. I did think it was a very smart and great way to kick off the action by jumping straight into the aftermath and mayhem of the crash, and then going back to reveal some of what happened before the crash in flashbacks. And I do think that doing the pilot this way is what gave them the idea to do the entire series this way and had the format where each episode explores a character's backstory through the use of flashbacks. Now, as for the rest of the pilot part 1, this is where my interest wanes, as I was not as impressed by it, and it does kind of come off as a stereotypical disaster movie, where we see Minnie talking about the rescue party coming and meeting each other and learning to work together to survive. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's not particularly stand-out-ish like most of the rest of the series is, which is why I wouldn't put this episode anywhere near a best list of the best of the show, but that's just me. The Shannon and Boone scenes in particular I found annoying, and I felt they didn't belong. However, I do like the way they introduced the other characters like Charlie, Hurley, and Claire. Although I will say I like the scene with Kate stitching up Jack's wounds. I thought that was a great interaction and a good way for these characters to meet. I think later seasons will reference this whole count to 5 speech way too much, as it is kind of great, and the showrunners seem but it's not as iconic as the showrunners seem to think it was, just my opinion. Anyway, the monster reveal didn't impress me all that much. In retrospect, I know it will be used later on, and as I said, I saw that before I watched this episode, so I already knew because I had already seen the season 1 finale at this point. But even if I put myself in the mindset of someone seeing this for the first time, it comes off as a bit gimmicky for me. And even when they go to the front part of the plane to find the pilot and encounter the monster, there seems kind of like contrived way to kill the pilot, so that they wouldn't have his guidance. But that being said, I did like the reveal of the pilot saying that they were way off course when they crashed, so the rescue parties wouldn't be looking in the right place. That brought a real sense of dread, and it made it clear that everyone's notions that they would be rescued shortly were misguided. So that was a decent ending for me. So it was a decent episode, but nothing great. So next, we'll get into the pilot part 2, where we get a bit more into the characters. We find out Charlie is a drug addict, Kate is a fugitive, Saeed is from Iraq and fought in the war against America, Boone and Shannon are brother and sister, and Sawyer is an asshole that no one likes. In fact, part 1 of the pilot focused more on Jack, and part 2 kind of takes a back seat so we can meet everyone else, which I like, as in this episode it focuses more on him healing the marshal who was escorting Kate. Meanwhile, we see a bond start to form between Michael and Sun, and Jen is a total dick to Sun, constantly telling her to button up. Now, I know some will say nothing we see later in Jen's character or backstory contradicts his behavior here, which I guess is technically true, but I still think it doesn't fit into the type of relationship Sun and Jen will be shown to have at this point, and I would very much argue that this dynamic was retconned later on by the writers. But I did really like the fight between Saeed and Sawyer, where Sawyer accused Saeed of being a terrorist. That kind of stereotyping bigotry most definitely was commonplace only 3 years after 2001. And Sawyer in particular was the type of ignorant asshole to do it. And the fact that Sawyer was being a dick to Hurley when he was simply trying to calm things down really spoke to his character. And I like how the fight shows how fractured this group is, who are essentially a group of strangers with nothing in common other than they happen to be on the same flight. And it illustrates how volatile this group of strangers can be. And that is, of course, will be an interesting sign of things to come. And we get introduced to the adventure music, which is one of the most iconic pieces of music in this show, filled with amazing music, as the group of characters hike up to the top of the hills to try to get reception on their little device. Of course, this isn't the best use of this piece of music, as it does get used better later on, but this is the first time it's used. And we get the intro of the polar bear in a tropical island in the South Pacific. Now, I have no doubt that the writers didn't have any idea why it was there, and they just added it to the show to illustrate how weird the island is. But I did like the explanation that they would give later on how the polar bears got to the island. I have no doubt that they didn't come up with this explanation until much later, but I do think it really works. However, the way it behaves in this episode is almost more like a monster than it is a bear, but whatever. Also, we get the iconic creepy scene of Locke explaining back into Walt, where he says there are two sides, one is light, one is dark. I've seen entire essays and 12-page theories on this scene alone. Personally, I'm not as enamored by this scene. I don't think it's all that profound. I think it was just a simple matter of foreshadowing the dark and light within everyone, although I know some will say it was foreshadowing the storyline of Season 6, but I think when they were writing Season 6, they kind of crafted it to resemble this scene rather than there being any forethought involved. But what I really thought worked about this episode was the ending where they heard the transmissions from the French woman. That was a very effective creepy scene, and absolute amazing way to foreshadow the creepy weirdness that the rest of the show will go into. Particularly how they had Shannon trying to decipher the French message at the same time Saeed was trying to figure out how long the message had been playing for, and the way she translated, "They're dead, they're all dead, I'm alone now, please help," and then Saeed confirms the message had been playing for 15 years. That was so eerie. It was an amazing moment in the show. So overall, I did like this episode, but I still wouldn't say it's amazing. More of an indication of how good the show would get later on. So next episode is Tuberosa, and I get why this is a necessary next episode, as the most imminent and urgent mysteries left from the pilot is Kate's origins, as the marshal who was escorting her was mortally wounded in garnering Jack's attention, and why the survivors find out someone amongst them is a fugitive. Now, it's interesting to note that this was the first episode to focus entirely on one character while exploring their backstories via flashbacks, which would become the normal format of the show. And as I said, it makes sense to start with Kate, although flashbacks don't really tell us what she did to become a fugitive. It does explore the moments leading up to her capture in Australia and how she ended up being escorted by a U.S. Marshal back to the States. And it's almost more important to know about that, as it's more relevant to the Marshal currently at death's door. Also, there was a mystery set in the pilot episode of Kate asking him for a favor right before the plane crashed, and we didn't hear what the favor was. But in this episode, we see that it pertains to the flashbacks that we see in this episode, as it has to do with the farmer she was staying with in Australia that turned her in. This illustrates her strength in character, as instead of holding a grudge against him for turning her in, she wanted to make sure that he was cared for. So it sets up that even if she's a fugitive, she's one with a heart of gold. Although I will say that when they did follow up on what Kate's favor was, they replayed the flashback scene from the pilot episode, which to me illustrates that this episode was made months after the pilot episode, which can also be seen in how Sawyer's hair is instantly much longer. But in watching the episode, it's immediately after the pilot, so it's actually unnecessary to replay a scene that we just saw in the previous episode. But I will say I like the start of this episode that had the immediate follow-up to the group that climbed to the top of the hills, having just heard the creepy French message, in which they decided it would be best to lie to the others about what they heard. I thought that was a very effective scene that gave proper weight to the creepy scene at the end of the pilot. However, for the rest of the island story, the episode I wasn't as impressed with, as it seemed kind of a typically dragged out storylines that would become the detriment of the show, where the characters' behaviors seemed a tad bit contrived. For example, the way we saw all the various characters complaining about the Marshal screaming and Sawyer going to Kate, saying, oh, whoever has a gun needs to put him out of his misery. I didn't really buy any of that, but I will say I liked the scenes where Sawyer shot him, but failed to kill him, so Jack had to finish him off. That was dark and powerful and betrayed just how dire their current situation is. And we also had a few side plots that developed over long-term character dynamics, such as Michael not wanting Walt to hang around Locke, and Locke finding Walt's dog for him. But I did find that iconic 360 shot of Locke at the end of the episode that most people tend to love a bit contrived. It's like they were trying too hard to portray Locke as a creepy villain, and upon reflection I don't really think it works. But in any event, I would say that this is a decent episode, but not a particularly good one. So, next episode is Walkabout, and this is what I was referring to earlier when I talked about the first great episode of the show. When I watched the show in order, this is the first episode that really got me to stand up and notice it as a great show. In fact, many will call this one of the best episodes of the entire show. I'm not sure if I'd go that far, because the episode does feature a lot of uninteresting setup that isn't that interesting to watch in retrospect, as it features Claire gathering information on those who died during the crash, in order to conduct a service when they burn the fuselage, and Jack trying to talk to Rose, who's traumatized and won't speak to anyone, and of course the scenes with the boars come off as a bit ridiculous. Again, the show tends to treat animals as if they were monsters. But where this episode shines and where it stands out is the introduction of John Locke. I'm not just talking about his flashbacks, but the island story of the survivors learning who John Locke is. Even though it is mostly done through the storyline of the boar hunt, it was still excellent has it furthered the mysterious man who we've only seen mostly in the background to this point. And the way they introduce him, starting with bringing out a suitcase full of hunting knives that he clearly knows how to use, portrayed him as quite the badass. And we jump straight from that to a flashback of Locke sitting in a cubicle talking on the phone and someone calling him Colonel, and he responds in military speak, which was a very successful fake out, because we're assuming he's some military badass, a secret agent, a high-up CIA guy, but no, turns out he's some loser working at a box company who's picked on by his boss and who refers to a phone sex operator as his girlfriend. So this is contrasted by the island storyline where we actually see him being a badass. So it's obvious that something has changed in his character since coming to the island, and by the end of the episode we see what that change is, and an absolutely amazing scene that I do think is one of the best moments of the whole show. When we see him arrive at the walkabout, he's been raving about for months and telling everyone it's his lifelong dream. It's revealed that he actually can't walk and that he's wheelchair bound. And then it flashes next to the plane crash where he's discovering for the first time that he can walk, as you see him wiggle his toe and then climb to his feet. It was an absolutely amazing moment, one of the most iconic moments in all of television, I would say. So so much was portrayed in this one scene that Locke wasn't just pathetic before he came to the island, but he was paralyzed, and that he can now walk again, and is now everything that he wanted to be, the fierce jungle hunter whom everyone looks to as a leader. But more than that, it further showcases how special the island is, and that it's capable of healing those who were paralyzed and allowing them to walk again. It was overall a huge step for the show, and for me, the thing that blew it wide open. And while I wouldn't necessarily call this one of the best episodes of the show, that moment where we see Locke was paralyzed and the island healed him was certainly one of the best moments of the show. And this was the first great episode of the show that really made me realize how great the show is, and it's not just a typical disaster cliche story about a plane crash. So overall, a hallmark of the series, an extremely powerful episode. So, next episode is White Rabbit, which in its own way is also an iconic episode. However, I wasn't as impressed with this episode as the previous one. In it, we finally get Jack's backstory. I must say, the way it was delivered was really powerful. In flashbacks, we saw him going to Australia to find his father, and in the island story, we see him seeing visions of his father and going off into the jungle to find him. And the parallels of these two stories work very well and were extremely powerful. As for one, Jack's state of mind was pretty much the same, as he felt he was losing his mind and going insane in the island storyline, and in the flashbacks he was freaked out, worried about his father. And the ending where it shows him finding out that his father had died was really powerful. It tears me up every time, particularly how it's coupled with Jack freaking out after finding the empty coffin on the island. It was an absolutely amazing use of coupling flashbacks and island storyline that's rarely done. And of course, we also get the epic speech, which will be referenced numerous times throughout the rest of the show, where Jack tells everyone who is feuding that if they don't learn to live together, they're going to die alone. And I must admit, that was a good speech and a good character moment for Jack, as he realizes how to be a leader and how important it is to bring everyone together. And of course, it's an important moment for the group overall. What I find less interesting about this episode is the plot about the water going missing and Sayid and Kate trying to figure out who stole it, and we get to get the blame Sawyer red herring that they use a lot, and the reveal that it was Boone the whole time. Yawn. That was silly. It seemed like a contrived way to have a conflict, if you ask me. And then Jack falling off a cliff. Yeah, again, felt like fake stakes. But overall, I would say this is a very good episode, but just not as classic as the previous episode, in my opinion. So after that, we get House of the Rising Sun, because Get it? It's about sun because it's a flashback episode and rising sun. Whatever. Anyway, this sort of expanded the whole moving to the cave storyline, which I'm not really big on, as I felt like it was the definition of filler, as it just gave the characters something to do, a conflict to fight over, just so they could get some screen time. And the whole thing about Kate being split on whether to go to the caves or stay on the beach, I didn't really care about. Although I will say I did like that they backed off on the Kate and Jack romance a bit, because it was pushing full steam ahead on that to the point where I thought they'd be married soon. So I'm glad that they pumped the brakes on that. And then this throwaway scene of Charlie stepping on a beehive and saying he's terrified of bees, a character trait never mentioned before and never mentioned again, felt like a lame excuse to have tension in this episode. To me, what was more interesting about this episode was the Sun and Jen story, as they did play with the fact that these two characters couldn't speak English and the issues that would lead to as Jen beats the ever-loving crap of Michael, seemingly out of nowhere and for no reason, because he can't speak English, nobody knows why. Of course, they do put subtitles on Sun and Jen's Korean when they speak to each other alone, but the dialogue is carefully worded to avoid giving away what Jen's motivations were. Although, this does bring up a slight issue for me, because Sun was clearly trying to indicate to Michael and Saeed at the start of it that it was because of the watch, as she was pointing to her wrist, but Saeed misinterpreted that as her wanting them to take the cuffs off of Jen. The problem I have with this is, if Sun really wanted to communicate it was the watch, she could have done a much better job without speaking English. For example, she could have walked up to Michael and pointed directly at his watch and then pointed to Jen. I'm sure they will say that, I'm sure that Saeed would have gotten it eventually. But for purposes of the plot, they couldn't find out that way because the plot required for Sun to reveal that she spoke English to Michael. However, I would say I did enjoy the reveal that she actually spoke English. I can't personally say that I was shocked when I saw this episode because I watched it out of order, so I already knew that she spoke English before I saw this episode. But if I hadn't been aware, I'm sure I would have been shocked. But what I liked most about this episode is the flashbacks with Sun and Jen, and I'm sure many have noted before, it was a groundbreaking moment for a primetime US network show to have an episode take place almost entirely in a foreign language. But also the story it tells is full of interest. It's of an impossible love story between a poor man and a daughter of a rich man who is, shall we say, involved in some less than legal activities. And at first it seems like they overcome impossible odds when the rich father grants the poor man permission to marry his daughter. However, this soon comes soured when it's slowly revealed that the price for that permission was that the poor man has to essentially become his lackey and do some really shady shit that involves coming home completely covered in someone else's blood. And this, of course, is not what Sun signed up for, and so plans to just run away to America, which explains why she can speak English. In the scene where she's at the airport, at the designated time she's supposed to run away, but Jen smiles at her and shows her a flower, which stops her from leaving as she cries, was an extremely powerful scene. This is the signature of Lost, the powerful, heartfelt, emotional stories that unfortunately in the first season more often than not were often accompanied by filler island storylines that weren't quite as interesting. But I still thought the love story between these two characters was really powerful, so overall a really good episode. So next episode is The Moth, and this was another great character flashback story accompanied by BS filler island storyline. Although the island storyline wasn't all that bad, but the storyline with the cave-in was an all too obvious way for them to create tension in the episode and was a borderline cougar moment. Borderline. Wasn't quite that bad. And those who've seen 24 will catch the reference. So again, I wasn't interested in the island storyline except where it pertained to the main character story. And in this case, the character story we followed was of Charlie, and who other than Jack and Kate was probably the character we were introduced to the most in the pilot episode and had most of a presence. And I think this episode did an amazing job of fleshing out Charlie's backstory, as the flashbacks work extremely well, showing his relationship with his brother and how at first it was all about the music, but the fame and everything corrupted that and turned it into something dark, and it became about drugs. Now, that's not a particularly unique story. In fact, it's a story that's been told dozens of times before, but the episode tells this common story in a very unique way. And I love how the flashbacks don't actually show Charlie using drugs, but instead focuses on the reasons why he got addicted. And it's interesting that he was seeing his brother ruin his life with drugs, and rather than that be a deterrent, it actually attracted him, in part because I think he wanted to be closer to his brother. And it was interesting the way the flashbacks jump forward to a point in time where Charlie was hooked, he was addicted, but his brother had turned his life around and was clean and was raising a family. It's interesting that this took place right before Charlie got on the plane, so basically just a few days ago. And overall, I do like how the flashbacks overall span a long time frame. I think it paints a very clear, a very powerful portrait of who Charlie is. I think the biggest issue with doing it this way is that it kind of leaves very little left to explore in Charlie's backstory. And not getting into spoilers too much, but future Charlie-centric episodes kind of prove this to be the case. And although I really didn't like the storyline with the cave-in, in fact I would say that storyline almost ruins this episode for me, I did like Charlie's journey in the island storyline having to go through withdrawals. And as cheesy as it is, I did kind of like the thing with Locke saying that Charlie had to ask him 3 times for his heroin. I know in the commentary for this episode, the showrunners made a joke about saying, oh, it was going to be 14 times he had to ask her. Charlie would just be like, can I have it now? How about now? How about now? Can I have it now? And really, Charlie could have done this with the 3-time things anyway. He's like, you have to ask 3 times. Okay, can I have it? Can I have it? Can I have it? That's 3 times. But I did like the point of doing this way, that Locke was leaving it up to Charlie, but he was making sure that he had to really think about it. And I have to admit that the scene at the end of the episode where Charlie did ask for it for a 3rd time and Locke gave it to him and he just threw it into the fire was a very powerful, very touching scene. So definitely I have to give this episode credit for that. And the analogy of the moth, that was great when Locke told Charlie the story. I think that was a really great analogy, summed up the theme of the episode perfectly, and I think the title of the episode is really fitting. But I think they overdid it by having a moth be the thing that Charlie follows to find a way out of the cave. When that happened, I was just like, okay, hold on. That's a bit much. Now you're overdoing it. The analogy actually works better without that. But overall, I would say the strengths of this episode far outweigh any drawbacks. And it is, in fact, a pretty powerful episode. So finally, we come to Confidence Man. And I give this episode an A for effort. I kind of like the concept of it, but I have a few issues with the execution. So first off, this is the first big Sawyer episode that gets into the mindset of this character who has been portrayed on the show so far as pretty much just an asshole that no one likes. And I have to say, in contrast to the previous episode that perfectly explored Charlie's character in a way that made future portraits of him kind of unnecessary, whereas here I thought they did kind of a poor job of fleshing out Sawyer's character, and future episodes would actually do a much better job of it. Now the thing about the flashbacks in this episode is that they are pretty irrelevant, as the flashbacks exist pretty much solely so they can be a fake out. Although I think there's a much worse example of the show doing this in Season 4. Those who have seen the show probably know what episode I'm talking about, but for those who haven't, don't worry, I'll get there eventually. But the reason why this episode isn't quite as bad is at least the flashbacks did give you an idea of what Sawyer's routine as a con man was like and the kind of cons and things that he was up to. But other than that, it's just meant to fool you into thinking that Sawyer swindles a man who kills his wife in front of their son because of it, but you find out, dun dun dun, it was Sawyer whom it happened to as a kid, and he was in fact the one who wrote the letter. Now, I kind of like this reveal and I kind of don't. In some ways, I kind of think it would be better if they just kept it straightforward and have Sawyer be the one that made a husband kill his wife in front of their child, and now he has to live with that regret. Instead, it's a story of irony where he witnessed something as a child and then grew up to become the thing that he hated the most. And I guess that works. I mean, I like what they do with this going forward, but it just kind of seems like the show is going out of its way to trick you, where the more straightforward storyline might have actually been more interesting. And the flashback in particular was a bit hard to buy. I mean, did he not know that the couple he was swindling had a child? I mean, if he's such a great con man, you think that he would do a little research before actually conning them. I mean, if this was such a deal breaker, if having a kid would make him drop the deal entirely and pretty much screw him, you think that's something he'd look into before he started conning them. And really, how does not having a kid make it much better? I mean, it's okay for the husband to kill his wife as long as they don't have a kid to witness it. And also, it seems like they had the perfect opportunity with the gangster threatening Sawyer. If he didn't deliver on this deal, that he clearly didn't deliver on, and so the gangster was threatening to kill him. So they could have explored what the consequences of that would be, yet it's never dealt with again. So again, I have to say the events of the flashbacks were pretty inconsequential and just there to fool you, when it almost seems like it would have been better had there been no twist at all. And as for the island story, all of a sudden, Shannon has asthma, which she needs an inhaler for, which was never mentioned before, never be mentioned again. She just needed to have asthma for the plot, and so she did. And I love how Boone said, oh, she's embarrassed by it, so she sneaks hit when no one else is looking. Sure, Boone, sure. Or should I say, sure, writers, sure. Yeah, she had asthma all along. We believe you. Now, I did kind of like Saeed's aspect to the story, how it brings out that he was a torturer, and it's a side of himself that he's not very proud of. And I must say, I did really like the scene where Jack and Saeed captured Sawyer, and I thought that was really intense. Kind of didn't buy that Sawyer didn't just tell them that he didn't have the inhalers to begin with. I know, they try to push it off as a character trait, that he wanted people to hate him, but I think it's more of a plot convenience, because if he did simply tell them that he didn't have the inhalers to begin with, then there'd be no plot. Anyway, I would say overall that this is a good episode, but nothing special. Nothing to write home about, or nothing to write an angry letter to keep with you and keep staring at from all the time about. Anyway, so that is it for my spoiler-free section of Lost Season 1, Part 1. So if you haven't seen to the end of the series, all the way to the end of Season 6, you will not want to watch any further. Thanks so much for watching. I will be back in 2 weeks with Part 2 of my coverage of Season 1, where I will cover episodes 9 through 16. So if you're watching along with me, you have 2 weeks to get caught up to episode 16. And also, I do other videos on other shows like Star Trek, Game of Thrones, The Expanse, Better Call Saul, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all that. And thanks a lot for watching. But for those of you who have seen all 6 seasons of Lost, you can follow me to my spoiler section, which begins now. So again, I'll go through the spoiler section episode by episode. So I'll start with the pilot, which I don't have much to say about, as this episode was revisited so much within the next 3 seasons. But as I mentioned before, it's confirmed and apparent to me that when they wrote this episode, they had no idea what the answer of any of these mysteries were, and just decided to throw in a bunch of weird shit that looked cool. I'm sure people can come up with a lot of explanations of why the monster, for example, behaves the way it does in this episode. I'm sure many in retrospect could say that it kills the pilot and not Jack, Kate, or Charlie because the pilot wasn't a candidate and the rest were. But honestly, all of that is just fansplaining, because the writers clearly did this shit because it looked cool and no other reason. I think the reveal of the French transmission was kind of inconsistent with how it was portrayed later on, and it would were just trying to fit it in where they wanted the story to go. But as far as the polar bear goes, I actually love the explanation that they were brought to the island by a group of scientists who are using the polar bear's natural relationship with electromagnetism to study the electromagnetism of the island. I think that makes perfect sense, and whenever anyone like Howard Stern complains about the polar bears in the island or says it makes no sense or is never explained, bullshit! It was totally explained, and it makes total sense. Although, again, this is something the writers came up with in retrospect, and in this episode they just added a polar bear because it would be weird and look cool. Anyway, next episode is Tabula Rasa. I actually don't have anything to say about this one with spoilers, so I'll just move on to Walkabout, which I do have some stuff to talk about. First of all, let's start with the Rose stuff. I love the foreshadowing of her saying that her husband is still alive and that people in the tell section survived, and they're thinking that they're all dead, because this does in fact turn out to be the case. And I don't think the writers had any specifics in mind, but I do think they had an idea that they wanted to follow up on this in the future. And then there's the big mystery people speculated on until the end of the show about how Locke saw the monster and it let him live. Many were upset that this was never fully explained, whereas some thought that it was explained enough. In the next episode, he said he looked into the eye of the island and that what he saw was beautiful, and many speculate that he was referring directly to his encounter with the monster. And later, he would refer to it as a bright light. Now, the retrospect fansplaining could say that since the monster was created by the light, the heart of the island, which is the source of all good in the world, that is what Locke was seeing when he saw the monster, which is in fact the heart of the island. But no one ever sees that with the monster ever again. It's never referenced. Later, the monster is just portrayed as an evil, black thing, period. There's no indication that you can see the light when you look at the monster. So honestly, I think this is a retcon, and they had no clear explanation of what John was saying when they filmed this episode, and they couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation, especially when this ends up meshing with what they wanted to do with portraying the monster as an ambivalent embodiment of evil. And that's why it's never touched on again. I know, maybe I'm being cynical, but that's just how I see it. So, next episode is White Rabbit. So, the events of this episode were referenced directly in Season 6 when Jack meets the Man in Black, who in that season took on the form of Locke, and Jack asks him head-on why he took the form of his father and made him chase him through the jungle, and he says that they needed to find water, and he was leading them to water. Jack is kind of dubious about this explanation, and I think it's justified, especially if one considers the scene where Jack nearly fell off a cliff while chasing him, as this can be explained by the fact that the smoke monster can't kill Jack directly, so is trying to kill him indirectly, and I do think that's what the writers were suggesting in Season 6. But again, no way did they plan for any of this in any way, shape, or form here. And I've heard some complain that it was never explained what happened to Christian Shepherd's body, but I think there's a very simple explanation for that the smoke monster took it away, as it's been established that it needs a body there in order to take its form. Well, for the most part anyway, there's always inconsistencies. So next is House of the Rising Sun, where we get the introduction of Adam and Eve, the two bodies found in the cave that Jack identified by their clothing as having been there for about 50 years. And for years, while Lost was airing, the showrunners insisted that the reveal of who these two bodies were would prove that they had everything planned all along. It would make them geniuses. It would show that they had a huge master plan, when in fact it proves almost the opposite, the exact opposite, which is really quite ironic in my opinion, because it was revealed that these two bodies were the bodies of the smoke monster and his adoptive mother that had been there for about 2,000 years. So much for Jack's 50-year estimate. And yes, I have heard many excuses that Jack's estimate was just wrong. Bullshit! Bullshit! It's beyond obvious that this is in fact not what they had planned at all. Even though it was never stated implicitly, it was obviously implied that these two were lovers, not mother and son. And the black and white rocks do make some think that the writers had some, plan of where they were going with season 6. But I think it was more just a vague idea of where they were going. But I think what they ultimately did was very obviously just thought up for season 6, and this does not show that they had everything planned, not in the least. So, next episode is The Moth, where Sayid tries to find the source of the distress signal, and he's bonked on the head by a mystery man that is later revealed to be Locke. And watching this episode again, I very strongly believe the writers had no idea who it was. And well, they're just like, yeah, we'll figure it out later. To be honest, Locke doesn't make any sense in the context of this episode, as he was out skinning boars and didn't even know what Sayid was planning, let alone the exact spot he'd be in. Plus, he was shown skinning a boar near the caves where Charlie came to ask for his drugs a second time, and then Sayid was attacked, and then he was shown at the caves at night where he gave Charlie the drugs. I find it impossible to believe that he could have went all the way to where Sayid was and then all the way back in time for the campfire. And also in the next episode, Sayid asks him about his whereabouts, and Locke implicates Sawyer in the attack, and in retrospect that makes Locke a lot more devious than he tends to be, so I don't really buy it. Although he has been portrayed as someone who wants to stay on the island, who doesn't want to leave, but it does make him a bit of the obvious choice too. I was kind of against the whole leaving who the attacker was a mystery thing, as it kind of is unnecessary, not that interesting, but whatever. So next episode is Confidence Man, which I actually don't have anything to say about regarding spoilers, so I'll just end the video here. I'll see you in 2 weeks. Thanks so much for watching.